As you've just heard, on Sunday, July 7th, the French head to the polls to elect their MPs in the second round of the snap parliamentary elections. Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally has secured 34% of the vote in the first round. Will they be able to repeat that result?
Now, our guest will be joining us to discuss this particular topic, Mr. François Hublet from the Managing Editor Blue. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So we are looking at 34% for the National Rally, which is not enough to win an outright majority. We can expect some political horse trading within the next few days. Can you tell us a little bit about how these political maneuvers will be made?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to understand that this election is not proportional representation based. So it's not one single election where you would vote for one party and then parties would get seats according to the share of the votes they got. This election is 577 constituencies, in each of them 2 rounds of voting. And the first round, the first 2 or 3 candidates qualified for the second round, and in the second round, the candidates who gets the most votes gets elected. So of course, these 30% are not enough to get a majority of the votes of the people in France, but it could be enough to secure something between a third and maybe 40% of the seats. There also had been projections before where it seemed possible that the National Rally got an absolute majority. This is less so today, but caution is advised because the situation is still not completely clear.
Right, this is what I was going to ask you about. Is this procedure, this cordon sanitaire, do you think that it is going to work? I mean, some people did resign from running in order
Yes.
to make that happen. So do you think this will work?
So a lot of candidates indeed dropped from the race to try to support whoever was best placed to beat the candidates from the far right. Now, there are essentially 2 questions. The first one is, are the voters actually going to follow this advice of their first round candidates to actually vote for whoever is standing against them? And the second aspect is mobilization. So a very important factor in how much people would actually be able to defeat the far right is how much they would turn out to vote. Turnout is very low on Sunday because maybe people think the Rassemblement National would not have a majority anyway. Then that might actually have a very counterintuitive effect where they would get more seats than we would expect today.
Right. Looking on the other side of the aisle, though, if we look at the right-wing parties, do you think the Republicans will kind of put their support behind the National Rally? And do you think the mobilization will also be an issue for the National Rally? Or do you think that they might be riding this wave of, well, morale?
So first for Les Républicains, so this is a center-right party. It's sitting together with Donald Tusk's coalition in the European Parliament. They had been split in the course of the last years, and they now de facto split the party between those who wanted to work together with the Rassemblement National, with the far right, and those that want to follow a more centrist course. So those who remain in this kind of center-right area, they tend to vote less for the far right. The thing is, if they are polled against a candidate from the left, it might be that more than half of their voters actually turn out for the far right. So that's for your first question. Your second question was about mobilization and turnout and how that would facilitate the election for the far right. So what we've seen is in the European election, we've seen high turnout, so a lot of more participation than in the previous election, and the far right did well. So it's no longer the case that high mobilization would necessarily mean that the far right gets less votes. I think it really today depends on the region you're looking at. So in some regions and typically in urban areas, more turnout would probably mean more votes for the left. But if you look at rural areas in France today, it's possible that would actually profit the far right.
Very interesting. I just wanted to turn for a moment to Emmanuel Macron, because he's the one who called these snap elections. So do you think that the result, because his party already did quite poorly, will impact his political standing? Will he lose support from within his own party? And B, he faces this prospect of cohabitation, right? Governing with a prime minister who is not from his own party. So do you think that he will be able to handle all this?
These are two hard questions. So for the first one, I think it's quite clear that we've seen in the last days that a lot of people from Macron's camp were actually taking a very different stance than the president. One typical case is Edouard Philippe, who was the prime minister and who has another party that is part of this coalition around Macron, and who clearly said that the previous majority was dead. So he's now considering probably to run for 2027, which is the next presidential election. In the run-up, he will be still supportive of Macron, but with a more distant relationship than they had before. At least that's what we see today. A lot of ministers have also said that they wouldn't remain ministers after the election has passed, even if the party would do relatively well, because they think they won't have a majority. Now turning to the question of whether Macron will be able to actually govern in a cohabitation, it's actually a very hard question, because that would depend heavily on what kind of coalitions, what kind of agreements can be reached in the parliament. If we take a scenario in which we have centrist parties from the center left and center right that succeed in getting a workable majority in parliament, then that might be possible. It might be a kind of a new phase for French politics, where they might be able to form some kind of agreement that reminds us maybe of what is happening in Germany to some degree. But that is not something that the French are used to. So I think that's kind of different from the usual political culture, and it's kind of a gamble to try and make that happen. In a scenario where the far right would get an absolute majority, of course, things would be completely different, because he would indeed have to cohabitate with a very, very different kind of political party. And finally, if there is no clear majority, if the parliament is really hung in the sense that there is no one able to kind of create a majority of their own, then we enter complete new territories, because this basically has never happened so far. The president has always been able, despite his plurality, not majority of votes, to kind of keep their government afloat. If this is not going to happen, if the governments just get voted out very quickly, then we enter a completely unknown territory indeed.
All right, so now that the parties are opposing to Le Pen's national rally are trying to come together and, well, do a maneuver, what they call blocking the far right, and it involves sometimes voting for the candidates that are not really your first choice, but pretty much doing it just to make sure that the national rally doesn't get the majority. Do you think that's enough to mobilize and incentivize the voter to actually go out and pull the trigger to vote for, well, at least, I mean, when it comes to those that are more reluctant to pull the trigger for these electorates?
Yeah, this is really the kind of the key issue here. I think this issue is strongest when you're looking at center-right parties or even right-wing, moderate right-wing parties that have to be supportive of left-wing candidates that can be quite radical, and vice versa. A lot of politicians in France, in the center, center-left, center-right, are still relatively consistent in their saying that there should be no vote for the far right, and at least in the worst case, you should abstain, but then in the best case, you should definitely turn out to vote for the other candidate. Now, what we've seen is that this advice by political leaders tends to be followed less and less. It is still relatively strong on the left, I must say, where people tend to turn out to vote for center-right candidates relatively easily. It is much less easy if you have a more radical left-wing candidate that would need the support of say, center-right or right-wing voters. There, that might be way less efficient than even the polls today might anticipate.
Right, and as we see this growing rift within the French society between the radical left and radical right, what issues are really at stake in this election?
Well, a lot is at stake. I think the president hasn't had a parliamentary majority now for 2 years. The situation is very unclear. It is still possible, I think, that the far right gets an absolute majority, even though the polls today suggest the contrary. It might be that in the last 2 days, things can happen prior to elections. That would be a complete change in politics in France in almost every policy domain. Of course, one obvious issue is international relations. There has been official support by the Kremlin for the far right candidate. There has been a number of connections between Kremlin officials and French far right in the course of the last years. So that's definitely something that the whole of Europe is looking at with some worries today, and for very good reasons. Now, of course, in another scenario, which is today the most likely, where they wouldn't get an absolute majority, I think the most risky aspect is is instability, because of course they won't have a majority to govern. It is possible that governments get voted down repeatedly in the course of the last year. The president cannot dissolve the assembly again before a year. So this is definitely something that is going to impact most areas of public policy in France, mostly because the National Assembly won't be able to bring laws through the parliament. Well, another aspect that I can underline is the budget. So of course, it's one thing to vote laws, it's another to get a budget through. And I think it is really possible that we have serious issues with voting the budget in the next couple of months. So that's definitely something to be looked at. I think most policy domains will be impacted if something unexpected or even a far-right majority happens.
Right, so you've mentioned a shift in foreign policy. However, National Rally seems to be supportive of Ukraine, or is that not the case?
Yeah, that's the change in the discourse that we've seen in the last months. I think what is pretty clear, and that has been the case in most European countries since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that a discourse of clear support for the Kremlin has become impossible to sustain, and most right-wing parties that were having such positions have rejected them since then. There's exception. Austria is still very ambiguous, and the FPÖ, but otherwise most parties have really abandoned that line. What we've seen is there are also people speculating that the support of Vladimir Putin for Le Pen a couple of days ago was also tactical, kind of a revenge against their new line of being more pro-Ukraine, at least in the rhetoric, than they used to be. I don't think that a change in majority would completely compromise, I would say, the pro-Atlanticist majority in France, because the the president remains in control of a large share of the foreign policy in France, whatever happens. But that would significantly, I think, compromise the capacity of France to be a driver of pro-Ukrainian support in the EU and in NATO if such a government would be formed.
All right, coming back to the domestic policy issues in France, there's a lot of talk about the implosion of the center. We see polling and these numbers going either to the far right or the far left. And now there's this political horse trading involved with probably the necessity for some centrists to back the left-wing parties in order to block the far right from coming into power. Do you think that would actually accelerate the division and polarity?
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. So, I can see two scenarios emerge here. One would be the more optimistic scenario where there would be some kind of grand coalition, but parties would be able to present things in a positive light and at least have some, or I'd say a majority of centrist voters endorse this strategy and say, well, it's time for us to just rally around maybe some common denominator that might not be the best political program ever, but at least allows us to govern properly for some time. The other scenario that is less positive is one where they would continue fighting and basically maybe reach an agreement, but that would be perceived as some kind of political arrangement that would allow that would be presented by populists as some kind of elite agreement against the people. What is a bit worrying in this context is that we've seen polls in the last days that were showing that the majority of the respondents in France thought that indeed these kind of grand coalitions were agreements against the people. And that's of course a bit worrisome because coalition governments are a standard thing in most European countries. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, but political culture in France isn't really used to this thing, and it might be that it's just badly perceived by a majority of the electorate.
Right, so, and you've mentioned that Emmanuel Macron has the right to call for another election, however, only after a year. So it clearly went badly for his party. Do you think that he will do it? And he's also in office till 2027. So do you think these are the last years, his final years in politics?
These are definitely his last years, at least as of the current term, because he is barred from pursuing a third consecutive term. That's the law in France. So he cannot do more than 2 terms in a row. So he's definitely going to leave the presidential palace by 2027. Now, as of the question of what will happen in a year if no stable government gets formed, I think there will probably be a lot of pressure, especially if there's issue with the budget, to dissolve the assembly again, with the risk this time of an outright majority for the far right being even more prominent than today, probably because they would appear as the only alternative capable of getting a workable majority in parliament. The other aspect, of course, is the capacity of Macron himself to stay strong enough that he at least can remain in power, isn't in some way forced to resign in the course of the last 3 years. So far, he's always denied that he would resign at any time, but he also denied that he would dissolve the parliament. So there's a bit of uncertainty there as well. Definitely, his legacy has been impacted negatively by this situation. I mean, there's been a lot of misunderstanding or of incomprehension in the rest of Europe, basically, towards his move.
Right.
I would just add one more positive point, maybe, which is that indeed his majority is gone, but maybe he won't do as bad as was originally predicted. So maybe he can still sell this as some kind of reasonable performance.
François Hublet, thank you, sir, for being with us this evening and for your insights.
Thank you so much.